I put together this webinar because I came across a book and it was talking about teaching critical thinking skills to students. I know that's something that all of us are always looking for. When I had an opportunity to attend an ISTE Digital Leadership Summit, they had us sitting at round tables and they had different people, they called them provocateurs. Their job was to throw out extra questions or to be paying attention to everything everybody was saying. I was sitting next to this gentleman. His name's Darren Hudgens. When we were on one of the breaks, we were just talking back and forth about different things, and he mentioned that he had an opportunity to write a book. When you're working with your students, one of the things that I think everybody's trying to do is help them look at web pages, whether they're doing research or whether they're reading something, and try to really think about what it is that they're looking at and is it something that they can trust. So the book starts with a story about a news article that came up during the Mexican earthquake. The story really captured everybody's attention because people were feeling really upset and sad that this earthquake happened. There were schools that have collapsed, and it sounded like a reporter was talking with some of the people on the site of the school, and they found out that there was notice of some activity under the rubble. The rescuers seemed to think that they had found a little girl. There was a reporter who was kind of filtering this information. At another point, they came up with a name, Frieda Sophia. Eventually, the government became involved a little bit more in the story. The military became a little bit more involved in the story. And it turned out that unfortunately, there never was a child named Frieda Sophia. This is an interesting story, just as an adult, to think about how often we read the news and we have to take it for granted that what we're reading is true, especially when it starts coming from valid news sources. What the book starts talking about is that a lot of people just use that word fake news nowadays. And is there a difference between getting the facts wrong and being an intentionally deceptive person? How can you introduce these concepts to students, and how do these stories, how do they get the facts wrong sometimes? What they noticed in this example of the Frieda Sophia story was that whenever we read something, whether it's something in the news, whether it's something on Facebook or someplace else, if the story includes famous names and famous places, that's easily acceptable to us because we're used to those names and places. In the Frieda Sophia story, it was a top news item. The earthquake had just happened. It includes some facts. It was real news media who were trying to pass on the facts as they heard them from the rescuers. And then there were multiple news sources and government announcements. So if you follow this story online, and I put a link to the actual story on this screen, you can see that it was news stories like Reuters. It was the Mexican government who was all sharing parts of this Frieda Sophia story. And then there were the eyewitnesses. The rescuers were being interviewed. And we all had an emotional investment. It was so sad. There were a lot of people who died. Everybody wanted there to be a little girl who could be rescued. I just also want to mention that in Google Classroom, I have all of my slides up there. So whether you do it later or if you feel like doing it right now, the Google slides that I have on the screen are also available to you as a separate copy. What I'd like you to do for a minute is think about some major news events you personally witnessed throughout your life, and think about how has social media changed, for the better or worse, the way that you experience these points in history. And also think about, have you ever been duped by a fake news story or actually shared information that turned out to be false? And how might you share some of those experiences with students to help them stretch their thinking? And what Marilyn was sharing is how Facebook sometimes makes it so easy to share something. And I had a similar experience. Marilyn was sharing that she shared something, it seemed real. A friend pointed out that it actually was a false story, and then she removed it from her timeline. And I did the same thing. I don't remember what the topic was, but I remember reading something, and I couldn't believe what I read. And then I shared it online saying, has anybody else heard about this? And it turned out it was something from the website called The Onion, which is like a parody website. And same thing, I don't think I removed it. I think I added a comment saying, I'm so embarrassed. This was a fake story. It's important if you can think of things like that. If you find things that you've experienced, they're great things to share with the students. So within the book, it points out that in 2016, the word of the year was called post-truth. So every year, Oxford Dictionary chooses a word of the year. And the way that they choose it is by when they see how a word comes up a lot in news that never came up before. And the use of this word increased about 2,000% over its use in 2015. And it was interesting because what they said is that they found a news team, or actually it was called the Edelman Trust Barometer. They did a survey of 28 countries around the world, and amazingly, 59% of the respondents said they didn't trust what they saw represented as news in the media, and another 63% believe the average person does not have the ability to discern what's real news and stories that are made up. Also, it said that 65% of the people who were surveyed use social media sites and search engines as their news source. Also, in the US, a third of the respondents said that they trust government resources. So post-truth is the word of the year, and it's really continued on. One of the ways that we end up having these false stories spread is that people tend to pass on information, and that's even if a source that they see was already said to be false. So what the book was sharing is that people overwhelmingly search for ways to discredit the facts, and they continue to cling on to the story that seems like it should be real, but it isn't. And that people are also, and I think you probably have seen this, they're far more willing to share information that supports the way that they think things are without taking time to dive into who's the news source and can I find somebody else who's also sharing the same thing, so that a lot of times in social media, things pass on pretty quickly because those who are passing them on may not be reading the story fully and may not be checking the facts. As I was reading this book, it reminded me of a song in Fiddler on the Roof where the villagers are sharing a story about the character named Perchik. And the story just kept getting crazier and crazier and crazier as the song went on. The people in the village trusted each other. They were all of a like mind. And what the book was sharing is social media has a very interesting feature to it in that you can unfollow people and they don't necessarily know. I'll see in my social media over the last couple of years, people who will say, wow, I thought I was following so-and-so. I guess I'm not anymore. Maybe they unfollowed me. So you're able to unfollow people whose opinions don't match yours, and nobody's ever the wiser. There's really no social downside to unfollowing people who don't think the same way that you do. Another important feature when you're talking to students and helping them understand how to think critically is to realize that when they're on the internet, the way that they browse things has a direct impact on what else is shown to them. So you might remember back in 2018, the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, was in front of the Senate. They were kind of pressuring him to say, is it true that Facebook knows what you did even after you log out of Facebook? And Mark Zuckerberg kind of got a little squirmy about it because the answer has to do directly with how does the internet work? And the internet stores a browsing history. And our different websites that we use have the ability to look at that browser history. So it's also important to make sure that you keep on helping students year after year understand how it is that the internet works and what that browsing history does. If you haven't ever seen it before, there's a really great TED Talk called The Filter Bubble. And it's called What the Internet is Hiding from You. On the slide at the bottom of the screen, and when you see them in the Google Classroom, you can click on this link and watch the whole video yourself. It's pretty short. It might be 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. What this gentleman, Eli, is talking about is how he started realizing that the way that we get information is more and more, as each year passes, customized directly to you. And so what he was talking about is that as he was thinking through this concept, he asked a group of friends to Google a specific place and to tell him what it is they were seeing. What some friends were seeing was travel information, how to get to that location. What others were seeing was world news that was related to that place. The more that the internet's available to us and to the companies that we use, the more that the internet's hiding from you because it wants to give you a best personal experience. And you can think about that like Netflix. What's on your Netflix list and what's recommended to you is going to be very different from somebody else in your house and from other people. This might be a TED Talk that you could use part of with the students and leads to an interesting discussion. I'm going to switch over to the chat box again for a minute. What I'd like to do is ask you to tell me, how do you help students think about how the internet experience is customized to you? I'm going to continue on with the next piece, which is how do we support the learning of media literacy? Media literacy is really any time that you're using the internet to Google things and read things, if you're using social media to look at things and listen to stories. A lot of these ideas are things that we've talked about in the past. It's just a different methodology. And so the first thing that we want to do is actually in our technology curriculum map, talking to students about figuring out how current is the news. So it's important for students to realize that they need to look at when was something published. And if there's references, are those references close to this date or are they further away? It's also important for students to think about, is it important that the news is the most current for your topic? So when was it published? Hopefully it's closer to today's date rather than 10, 15 years ago. But you could have a conversation with students, when might it be important for a topic to be very current? So if we're talking about the price of gas or the tax rate, it would probably be more important to be worried about what that date is, and you might want it to be closer to today's information. If you're talking about an event in the 1800s, perhaps it's okay that it was published 10 or 15 years ago, as long as the information is relevant to what they're talking about, which comes to the next piece. Is it relevant? Again, that's in our technology curriculum map, talking about, does the information relate to my topic? And what audience is it written for? So if you're looking about electric cars, and it's an article about models of electric cars, the info would relate to the topic. But if the students are reading something from a technical manual, it's not an appropriate level for their needs. If they're reading something from Times for Kids, that would probably be more relevant. Then we talk about, is it authoritative? Who's the author or organization, and are they qualified? Is it edited or peer reviewed? And if it's a website, does the URL tell you anything? And again, this is something that we've talked about over time in tech integration workshops. If you need some more details on that, I can help you find some information. But again, talk with your students from time to time about looking at the website address, the URL. If it's coming from something.gov, it's a government website, it's probably more trustworthy. If it's coming from something.com, anybody could write an article like that, but if it's written by a zoologist and you're looking at animals, that would be a good author, as opposed to it's written by somebody that you can't find any details about. Is it accurate? It's important that students think about where the information's coming from. I had pointed out at the beginning, I wasn't paying attention to something that I shared in social media until I had shared it and looked at it a little while later and realized it came from the website, the organization called The Onion, which is a parody organization. So kids need to think about that too. Where is the information coming from? Do they have references? Do they link to other articles? Sometimes teachers tell students they shouldn't look at Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is not a bad place to go to get an overview of a subject, and Wikipedia always has references. And sometimes it's those references that become really helpful to students. And finally, what's the purpose? Is it information they're giving? Is it advertising? Is it opinion? So these are ideas that come from the California State University Merriam Library, and I thought I'd share that with you. The next thing that we're going to look at is a little graphic that was put together, and it helps talk about precision versus different categories that could be considered fake news. And what I liked about the website is it gave a kind of green light, yellow light, red light look to these different levels of stories that could be false. And it also helps you understand what the people's motivation are. So there is a link to this chart in another slide or two, but it talks about 10 different types of misleading news. I'd like to pause for a second and see what you guys have been saying. So it's good that, Andrew, you're saying you do talk about how the internet experience is customized with their web search. That's awesome. And finding things that are alike and similar and how they've searched for the topic before. And Marilyn has been teaching some of these analysis ideas while doing research papers. That's fantastic. Give me a little thumbs up or thumbs down. Have you ever talked about these different types of fake news with your students? Propaganda, clickbait, conspiracy websites? So I got one yes. It's an interesting thing to talk about, because a lot of times the students will hear about propaganda. Oh, both of you did great. A lot of times teachers will talk to students about propaganda as far as propaganda in World War II, let's say. This is part of how false stories can spread online. And so this is a chart that you might be interested in looking at with students. It comes from the United Kingdom. And the impact it's saying of propaganda websites is kind of neutral. It's not terribly, it doesn't have a really high impact on people. It's sort of a neutral impact it has on people. And why do people use propaganda? It's because they have a passion, and it can also be because they're doing it for politics and power. It might be interesting to look at things and have students try to decide what type of inaccurate stories they're looking at. So it goes on to have these categories of the ones that you see on the screen right now. And in addition, sponsored content. So that's something that I think all of us can really inadvertently be pulled into. I think students as well, especially. Sponsored content might become an issue if they don't identify it's clearly labeled it's advertising. And why do people have sponsored content? Obviously to make money. Satire and hoax, there's that Onion article again. It's humor, it's funny, but it may not be clear unless you're looking that it's not accurate information. Errors have a low impact on people. Again, that's the yellow line. Sometimes news establishments make mistakes, but the important thing for students to realize is if you're looking at a reputable organization, they will generally publish an apology, or they'll update the article and say the reason why it was updated. So if you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, you'll see that they add and delete from the story, but they do say why it happened. Pseudoscience is a big problem. One of the things that you probably hear a lot about on the news, and maybe students do too, is that there are an awful lot of children who aren't vaccinated because some people were passing on either misrepresentation of scientific studies, or they just add their own information in. It often contradicts experts, and sometimes there are errors due to money reasons. Sometimes there are errors due to political or power reasons, but that has a really high impact on affecting the way that people think about things. Misinformation is another category. So it may not be exactly wrong, but they may doctor the facts, or they may have a headline that highlights something that is more unbalanced when you look at the big picture. And then, of course, there's just purely fabricated content. And a lot of times people put that out there just to get ad revenue or for political influence. So these are some really big concepts to go over with students. And what I liked about the book is that they share some examples that you could use with their students for them to decide whether something is factual or in one of those 10 categories. And it made me think about how used to it we're getting that what we see and hear isn't really what we're seeing and hearing. I remember the first time I heard of this idea of auto-tune, that voices can be corrected. And there's free apps on the internet that can help you change your voice, make it sound better. I was further interested in realizing that there are apps out there like this one called Facetune. So it's the idea of auto-tune, but it lets you make the perfect face for your social media. And so this one is a $3.99 app. And what it does is it smooths out wrinkles, or it changes the color in your teeth, or it removes blemishes. And so, we're so used to, on the one hand, knowing with our brain that things can be changed. But then we also get lost in stories we're reading or things that are shared with us, and we stop thinking. What I had done was I was asking for whichever educators were interested in doing a little survey with me about what tools that they as educators use regularly to access news and information. And then I was curious what kind of answers we would get if students shared the tools that they use to get news and information. And what implication does that have for the professional learning that you need to do? So again, let's go over to the chat. If you can, in the chat box, type a 1 through 5 to share how familiar you think you are with the tools that your students use regularly to access news and information. So 1 is I'm not familiar at all, and 5 is absolutely, I'm extremely familiar. So Marilyn gave us her number, and let's see what Andrea thinks. So we averaged about a 3.5, which, considering that you work with students every day, is pretty good. So middle of the road to getting a little bit towards the very familiar side. Where do you think that your students regularly access news and information? So I'll give you a couple seconds to type in an answer or two. And so when you think about online as an answer, where online would you think? So try to get a little bit more detailed about it instead of just the word online. We got MSNBC, Yahoo, Facebook, and Google News. A lot of the grown-ups are looking at some national newspapers. They're watching news on TV. And so mostly it's news apps. We see a couple of Facebooks, a couple of Twitters, a couple of Instagrams, YouTube, Twitter. And then we get down to the students, and more of them are on the social media for news. So they're reading Twitter, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram. Here is a very focused student looking at more national newspapers, but still backed up by YouTube, Snapchat, web search, a lot of YouTube. And with some students, some New York Times and Washington Post. Some of them are watching to the news and listening to the radio. A lot of YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram. If I pull up the chat again, yes, no, or maybe, you could type in the chat box. When you were thinking about how students listen to the news or read the news, did Snapchat, Instagram, and YouTube flick across your mind as sources of news for students? So that'd be like just a yes, no, or a maybe. So a yes and a not really. So I would say that also should have a part to when we're talking to students about news stories, to include examples like that when you're talking to them about propaganda and about pseudoscience and that kind of thing. And that's where this book came in with some really great examples that I'll share with you. Also, what the book suggests is that we want to talk to our students about ways to challenge an idea without diminishing a person. If you ever take a look at a stream of writing on Facebook or Twitter or any other social media, sometimes you'll see people with those black and white statements. You're wrong. I don't believe you. All people who believe that are fill in the blank. If you believe whatever, then you're not a real whatever. And this could be helpful if you're talking about teaching the students in, how to respond to each other in a place like Google Classroom or Edmodo or Seesaw or any other website. Talk to them about the fact that they could say things like, I've seen some evidence that contradicts what you're saying. Let me share this with you. And then add a link to something that you believe is more newsworthy. Can you show me some research that helped you form that opinion? I'd like to add more. And so it allows that other person some space to share what it is that they were reading. And then you can make your own decision. Do you think that is a more factual website, or do you think that they're still a little bit off? It's also fine to say we may not agree on this issue, but it doesn't mean that we still can't be friends, or to share, I respect your right to disagree with me. So, one of the things I always like about working with students in spaces like Edmodo and Google Classroom is you have a way to help the kids model the way that they're saying things, and maybe pull a kid over to the side and say, I noticed that you just said you're wrong. What's another way that we could have had that written in an online space? Gives them places to practice. So what you're looking at right now, this was included in the book, and there were probably about 12 or 15 of these. They had a little fake news self-assessment. So this could follow your discussion with students about propaganda, disinformation, conspiracy theories, prejudice, clickbait, satire, misleading statistics, altered images and videos. You can read the writing on the right-hand side, and maybe you've even seen this on your own social media. I absolutely remember seeing this a few months ago. So there was a news article, and its title is "Millions of Americans Think Chocolate Milk Comes from Brown Cows." It will give these little examples to the students to think about. They can check off a box that would say, I think this is legitimate, or I think this is fake news. They can share what app they think that this story was being accessed through. And then if the child feels that the story is fake, they can decide which category it belongs in and list some items that might make a person be suspicious. Finally, they can rate themselves on being from a 1 to 10, not very confident or very confident in their assessment. What would you say about this one? Would you believe that this is legitimate news? Or would you think that this is in the fake news category? And if you think it's in the fake news category, is there a category you think it belongs in? And how confident are you? So this is what you would be able to do with the students. They also give you the answers. This one is actually a real story, and it was appearing on Snapchat. And the only thing that they point out is it does use a misleading statistic to get you to click on it. So instead of saying only 7% of Americans believe brown cows produce chocolate milk, they say millions of Americans. And if you think about how big our population is, 7% of our country's population amounts to millions of Americans. Okay, let's try one more. This is another example. And again, I'd like you to do the same thing. Do you think it's legitimate or fake? And how confident are you? I have this book. It's available. So if you want to borrow it from me, feel free to, so that you could see what they have. This was actually a fake story that appeared on YouTube, and it was spreading disinformation. So it seems like there was some bad lighting that made it look as if his eyebrow falls off during the G7 summit. You know, the thing that we can talk about with students too is that there's different apps out there that allow people to edit videos in a really succinct way to make it look as if people are saying or doing things that they actually aren't. The book also has some other resources. So they share 19 tools for evaluating credibility. There are 15 sample lesson plans, 5 different tools for fact-checking content, and also 21 other resources for combating fake news. So as I said, the book is called Fact versus Fiction. And what I try to do is just give you an overview of the big ideas in the book, let you know that there are some self-assessments that you might be able to use with your students. And then after this webinar is over, I'll share some of those other resources when I send you your PD certificate for this.